The hospital doors slammed open with a force that made everyone in the waiting room jump. A young boy, no older than 10, burst through, his face flushed and his chest heaving as if he'd run a marathon. Clutched tightly in his small, trembling hands was an old, battered shoebox, the kind you'd normally toss aside without a second thought. But this wasn't just any shoebox. The way he held it, like it was the most precious thing in the world, made people stop and stare. Nurses behind the front desk exchanged worried glances. What could possibly be inside? And why was this boy, with his wide, desperate eyes, rushing into a hospital like his life depended on it? The boy didn't stop to explain. He darted past the rows of chairs, past the murmuring patients, and straight toward the nurses' station. His sneakers squeaked on the polished floor, echoing in the sterile, tense air. "Please," he gasped, his voice cracking as he thrust the shoebox toward the nearest nurse. "You have to help. It's really important." The nurse, a kind-faced woman named Linda, hesitated for just a moment before taking the box. She'd seen a lot in her years working at the hospital. Broken bones, worried parents, tearful goodbyes. But something about the boy's urgency sent a chill down her spine. What could be so urgent that a child would run in like this? Alone. And frantic? As Linda carefully lifted the lid, the room seemed to hold its breath. The boy's eyes never left her face, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. The other nurses leaned in, curiosity getting the better of them. And then, as Linda peered inside, her expression changed. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and for a moment, she looked as though she might drop the box. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached inside, pulling out something that made her gasp aloud. Tears welled up in her eyes and she quickly covered her mouth with her free hand, as if to hold back a sob. The boy's face crumpled, his own tears spilling over. "Can you fix it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, can you fix it?" But before Linda could answer, a loud beeping sound erupted from down the hallway. A doctor rushed past, shouting orders, and the moment was shattered. The boy turned, his face pale, as if he'd just remembered something even more urgent. "Wait!" he cried. But the nurse was already distracted, her attention torn between the boy and the chaos unfolding around them. The shoebox sat on the counter, its contents still a mystery to everyone but Linda. And as the boy took a step back, his eyes darting between the box and the hallway, it was clear that this was far from over. Whatever was in that shoebox wasn't just important. It was life-changing, but for whom and why? The answers were still hidden, just out of reach, leaving everyone in the room with more questions than they could possibly imagine. And as the boy turned and ran down the hallway, disappearing into the maze of hospital corridors, one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The boy's footsteps echoed down the hallway, fading into the distance as Linda stood frozen, the shoebox still in her hands. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd just seen inside. She glanced around the nurse's station, but the other staff were already moving, responding to the emergency that had pulled their attention away. The beeping from down the hall grew louder, more urgent, but Linda couldn't shake the image of the boy's face, his wide, pleading eyes, the way his voice had cracked when he asked if she could fix it. Fix what? She looked down at the box again, her heart pounding. Whatever it was, it had clearly meant the world to him. Linda had been a nurse for over 15 years, and she thought she'd seen it all. But this was different. The boy hadn't come in with a parent or guardian. He was alone, and the desperation in his voice had been raw, real. She couldn't just let him run off like that. Setting the shoebox down carefully on the counter, she turned to her colleague, a younger nurse named Sarah. "Can you cover for me for a minute? I need to find that boy." Sarah nodded, though her eyes were still wide with curiosity. "What's in the box?" she asked. But Linda was already moving, her sneakers squeaking against the floor as she hurried down the hallway. The hospital was a maze of corridors, each one looking eerily similar to the last. Linda scanned the area, her eyes darting from room to room. She passed patients in wheelchairs, doctors in scrubs, and families huddled together in quiet conversation. But there was no sign of the boy. Where could he have gone? And why had he run off like that? Her mind kept circling back to the shoebox. She hadn't had time to fully process what was inside, but the weight of it, both literal and emotional, had been overwhelming. It wasn't just an object. It was something deeply personal, something that carried a story she was now desperate to understand. As she turned a corner, she nearly collided with Dr. Patel, one of the hospital's most experienced physicians. He was holding a clipboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Linda," he said, glancing up. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "There was a boy," she began, her voice low. "He came in with a shoebox and I don't know. Something about it felt off. He was so upset and then he just ran off. I need to find him." Dr. Patel's expression softened. "A boy, you say, about 10 years old? Dark hair, wearing a red hoodie?" Linda's eyes widened. "Yes, have you seen him?" Dr. Patel nodded, but his face was grim. "He came through here a few minutes ago. He was asking for the pediatric ward. I tried to stop him, but he was in such a hurry. I thought maybe he was visiting a sibling or something." Linda's stomach dropped. The pediatric ward? Of course, that's where he would go. But why? She thanked Dr. Patel and hurried off, her mind racing with possibilities. Was there someone in the hospital he cared about? A brother? A sister? A friend? Or was it something else entirely? The mystery of the shoebox gnawed at her and she quickened her pace, her sneakers slapping against the floor. She had to find him. She had to know what was going on. When she reached the pediatric ward, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The walls were painted in cheerful colors, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from some of the rooms. But there was an undercurrent of tension, too, the kind that came with sick children and worried parents. Linda scanned the area, her eyes landing on a group of nurses gathered near the reception desk. One of them, a woman named Emily, looked up as Linda approached. "Hey, Linda, what brings you up here?" Linda didn't waste time with small talk. "Have you seen a boy come through here? About 10 years old, carrying a shoebox?" Emily frowned, thinking for a moment. "Actually, yeah, he came in a few minutes ago. He looked really upset. He went straight to room 214. Linda's heart skipped a beat. Room 214. She knew that room. It was where they kept the most critical cases. Without another word, Linda turned and headed down the hallway, her pulse quickening with every step. Room 214 was at the far end of the ward, and as she approached, she could hear the faint sound of voices. One of them was the boy's, soft, trembling, but determined. The other was a woman's voice, calm and soothing, but with an edge of concern. Linda paused outside the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She didn't want to intrude, but she had to know what was happening. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open gently. The scene inside stopped her in her tracks. The boy was standing by the bed, his small frame dwarfed by the machines and monitors surrounding it. In the bed lay a young girl, no older than 8, her face pale and her eyes closed. She was hooked up to an IV, her breathing shallow but steady. The boy was holding her hand, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to her. "I brought it, Lily," he said, his words trembling. "I brought it just like you asked. They're going to fix it. They have to." Linda's eyes darted to the shoebox, which was now sitting on the bedside table. The lid was off, and she could see the edge of something peeking out, something that made her breath catch in her throat. The woman in the room, a nurse named Carla, turned as Linda entered, her expression a mix of relief and confusion. "Linda," she said quietly, "thank goodness you're here. This boy, he says he knows Lily. He's been here before, but I've never seen him with her family. And this box," she trailed off, glancing at the shoebox. Linda stepped closer, her eyes never leaving the boy. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The boy looked up, his eyes red and swollen from crying. "Ethan," he whispered. "My name's Ethan." Linda nodded, her heart breaking for him. "Ethan, can you tell me what's in the box? Why is it so important? Ethan hesitated, his grip on Lily's hand tightening. He looked down at her, his lower lip trembling. It's her heart, he said finally. His voice, so quiet that Linda almost didn't hear him. She said if I brought it, they could fix her. She said they'd know what to do. Linda's breath caught in her throat. Her heart? What did he mean? She glanced at Carla, who looked just as confused. But before either of them could ask another question, the monitor beside Lily's bed let out a sudden sharp beep. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. What's happening? He cried, his voice rising in fear. Is she okay? Please, you have to help her. The room erupted into chaos as Carla rushed to check the monitor, her fingers flying over the buttons. Linda moved to Ethan's side, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. It's going to be okay, she said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. We're going to take care of her. But as she looked down at the shoebox, her mind was spinning. What had Ethan meant by her heart? And why had Lily asked him to bring it? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was clear. Whatever was in that box held the key to something much bigger than any of them could have imagined. And as the beeping grew louder, more insistent, Linda knew that time was running out. The beeping from the monitor grew louder, more frantic, filling the room with a sense of urgency that made Linda's chest tighten. Carla was already calling for backup, her voice steady but urgent as she relayed Lily's vitals to the team on the other end of the line. Ethan stood frozen by the bed, his small hand still clutching Lily's, his face pale with fear. What's happening? He asked, again his voice trembling. Is she going to be okay? Linda squeezed his shoulder gently, though she didn't have an answer. She didn't know what was happening either. All she knew was that they needed to act fast. As the medical team rushed into the room, Linda guided Ethan to the corner, giving them space to work. The boy's eyes never left Lily, his face a mask of worry and guilt. I did what she asked, he whispered, more to himself than to Linda. I brought it. I thought it would help. Linda knelt down beside him, her voice soft but firm. Ethan, I need you to tell me what you mean by her heart. What's in the box? Why did Lily ask you to bring it? Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting to the shoebox on the table. He looked like he wanted to explain, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. Before he could say anything, one of the doctors called out, We need to stabilize her now. Get the crash cart. The room erupted into a flurry of activity and Linda's attention was pulled away from Ethan. She stood, her training kicking in as she moved to assist the team. But even as she worked, her mind kept circling back to the boy and the box. What was inside? And why had Lily asked for it? The questions gnawed at her, but there was no time to dwell on them now. Lily's life was hanging in the balance, and every second counted. Meanwhile, Ethan stood in the corner, his small frame trembling as he watched the chaos unfold. He felt helpless, useless, like he'd failed Lily when she needed him most. He glanced at the shoebox, his heart aching with the weight of what was inside. He'd promised her he'd bring it, no matter what. He'd promised. But now, as the doctors and nurses worked frantically to save her, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. That he wasn't enough. Outside the room, the hospital hallway buzzed with its usual activity, but for Ethan, the world had narrowed to this moment, this room, this girl. Lily had been his best friend for as long as he could remember. They'd met in the park one summer afternoon, two lonely kids who found solace in each other's company. She'd been the one to teach him how to climb trees, how to skip stones across the pond, how to laugh even when things felt hopeless. And now, as he watched her lying so still in that hospital bed, he felt like a part of himself was slipping away too. The shoebox had been her idea. She'd told him about it one day, her voice soft but serious, as they sat on the swings at the Pariso. If something ever happens to me, she'd said, I need you to bring it to the hospital. They'll know what to do. Ethan had nodded, though he hadn't fully understood. He'd just known that he would do anything for her. Anything. And now, as he stood there, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd waited too long. if he'd been too slow, if he'd let her down. Back in the room, the medical team was making progress. Lily's vitals were stabilizing, though she was still unconscious. Linda stepped back, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped the sweat from her brow. She glanced at Ethan, who was still standing in the corner, his eyes glued to Lily. She could see the guilt and fear written all over his face, and it broke her heart. She walked over to him, crouching down so they were eye level. "Ethan," she said gently, "you did everything you could. You brought the box just like she asked. That was brave of you." Ethan shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. But what if it's not enough? What if she doesn't? "Wake up!" Linda didn't have an answer for that. She didn't know what the future held for Lily or for Ethan, but she knew one thing. They couldn't give up. Not yet. "We're doing everything we can for her," she said, her voice steady. "But I need your help, Ethan. I need to know what's in the box. It might be important. It might help us save her." Ethan looked at her, his eyes wide and uncertain. He glanced at the shoebox, then back at Linda. It's her heart," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "But not like a real heart. It's something else. Something she made." Linda's brow furrowed in confusion. Something she made? What did that mean? Before she could ask, one of the doctors called her over. "Linda, we need you." She stood, giving Ethan one last reassuring look before hurrying back to Lily's bedside. But as she worked, her mind kept circling back to the box. What had Lily made, and why was it so important? The mystery was deepening, and with it, the sense of urgency. Whatever was in that box, it was tied to Lily's fate. And if they didn't figure it out soon, it might be too late. As the minutes ticked by, Ethan stayed in the corner, his eyes never leaving Lily. He felt like he was drowning, like the weight of everything was pressing down on him. He wanted to be brave for her. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay, but the fear was too much, too big. And as he stood there, watching the doctors and nurses work, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something important. Something he'd forgotten. And then it hit him. The letter. Lily had given him a letter, too. She'd told him to give it to the doctors if things got bad. He'd been so focused on the shoebox that he'd completely forgotten about it. His heart raced as he reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the folded piece of paper. He pulled it out, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. The words were written in Lily's neat, careful handwriting, and as he read them, his breath caught in his throat. "Dear doctors," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm not doing so well. But don't give up on me. There's something you need to know." Ethan's eyes scanned the rest of the letter, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't understand all of it, but he knew one thing. It was important. More important than he'd realized. He looked up, his eyes locking with Linda's across the room. "I have something else," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "Something Lily wrote. I think you need to see it." Linda's eyes widened and she quickly crossed the room, taking the letter from his hands. As she read it, her expression changed, her face paling as the words sank in. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This changes everything." But before she could say more, the monitor beside Lily's bed let out another sharp beep, and the room was plunged back into chaos. The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than ever. And as Linda and the medical team worked to save Lily, the mystery of the shoebox and the letter hung in the air, unresolved and urgent. Whatever was coming next, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same.